I was class of 2022 at Duke, and I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, where the Perils are from. So this is very homey tonight. I am a member of the Duke Jewish Alumni Network, now also known as DJAN. I am so pleased to see you here tonight for our Duke Jewish Alumni Network Book Club series, hosted by DJAN, Jewish Life at Duke, the Jewish Book Council, and Duke Lifelong Learning. But before I pass it off, I want to tell you a little bit about DJAN, Duke's Jewish Alumni Affinity Group, which launched just over 2 years ago in September 2022. The mission of the Duke Jewish Alumni Network is to ensure that the Jewish community at Duke remains strong past graduation. DJAN, an affiliate of Jewish Life at Duke, engages and connects Jewish alumni through opportunities to interact with peers, foster Jewish identity, and build a network of Duke Jewish alumni for social and professional connections. DJAN welcomes alumni, students, faculty, staff, and friends of Duke. If you are a Jewish alum, you are automatically a member of DJAN. You can visit the Duke Alumni Network at alumni.duke.edu and find the DJAN page to learn more or join our affinity group. We are looking for volunteers interested in joining our programming and marketing committees, so look out for additional information. Now, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Linda Sterling, class of 1982 and Fuqua 1983. Linda currently sits on both the Trinity Board of Visitors and the Jewish Book Council Board. Linda has been involved with Duke as a member of the Duke Alumni Board, the Duke Engage Board, and more. Linda, on behalf of DJAN, thank you for facilitating tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Zoe. It's so nice to be here and see some of the people from Duke, New Jersey, and some of the people that have been on these calls before. So thank you all for coming tonight. I'm really happy to be here. Anybody that knows me knows I love to read, and was so happy to partner with Joyce on one of my visits to Duke to say, what can we do to get more people reading Jewish books at Duke? And so Joyce and I have worked together for a little bit on this. One of the best things about when you love to read is getting to hear directly from the author. And we have such a treat tonight because here we are to discuss Your Presence is Mandatory, and the author, Sasha Vasilyuk, hopefully I pronounced that right, Sasha, is here with us to kick off this discussion. So Sasha is a journalist and author who grew up between Russia and Ukraine before immigrating to San Francisco at the age of 13. He has written about Eastern Europe for the New York Times, CNN, Harper's Bazaar, Time, The Telegraph, and more. This is her debut novel, and what a tour de force it is. Out of the blocks, having such an amazing book. And I'm glad you're here tonight to talk with us, Sasha. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. This is amazing.
Yeah, so much fun. And you're out in San Francisco right now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So first off, I love this book. I've read a lot of books about World War II, never anything like this, and then learning more about Russia and Ukraine. So for me, I love a book where I can really gain new knowledge. So this novel explores the repercussions of a wartime secret on the family of a Ukrainian Jew, a Jewish World War II veteran. And it's so timely, given, especially in the last few days, in the last few months, in the last 3 years, what's going on. I know you were finishing the book and editing the last chapter, which takes place at the start of the Russian-Ukrainian War in 2014, right as Putin was launching the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about where the seed idea for this came from, when you started writing, the process of how long this took you to get this idea together? I know you did extensive research, so I'm just curious how this all came about.
Sure. Yeah, so the project for me started in 2007 when my grandfather, on whom Yefim, the main character, is based, passed away. And a couple of weeks later, my grandmother found this very short, it's like a page and a half, confession letter um, addressed to the KGB, the Ukrainian KGB, from the 80s. So it's like back to, they're almost 30 years old by that point, where he explains that while that the myth that he sort of propagated in our family of essentially being a war hero who kind of never talks about the war, but who survived the whole war and was there from day one until the very, you know, final battle of Berlin 4 years later, kind of like an amazing feat, given how many people did not survive those 4 years, let alone Jews, that he's sort of this war hero. And the letter showed us that he wasn't that at all, that he was captured very early on, and that the rest of his time in Germany was under various kind of these amazing adventures that he describes of surviving. And my first reaction when I learned of this, well, actually, I'll say this. My grandmother's first reaction to this was to not tell anybody because she felt sort of shame around it. This is, mind you, in 2007. Soviet Union does not exist at this point and hasn't for, a long time. It fell apart in 1991. And yet this kind of societal shaming of anybody who, quote unquote, sat out the war, which includes all prisoners of war, and these Ostarbeiters, which are people who were civilians who were carted away to work for the Germans. They were all kind of supposed to be ashamed, right? And my grandma doesn't want to tell anybody. Eventually, she sort of starts telling uh, the rest of our family. And when I find out, even though I'm 2 generations removed, I also immediately feel ashamed. And while at the same time, I actually know nothing, I knew like nothing about prisoners of war, except for the fact that I was supposed to feel ashamed that my grandfather was one. And that was an interesting sort of dichotomy that I eventually explored. However, I didn't actually work on this book for 10 years. So when we found the letter, this was in 2007, and I set the book kind of accurately in that time. But I didn't feel at the time that it was sort of urgent to write the story, even though it felt to me that this was a novel. It had all the like plot adventures of somebody who's surviving, and it had the psychological question of somebody who feels like they're forced to hide a secret and sort of what that does to the person hiding the secret and also to everybody around them. So it had these two elements that I think to an aspiring novelist, which I was at the time, felt like a great combination. But I just wasn't convinced that it's a story that like needed to be told. It was World War II. Who cares? B, B, I didn't know that kind of enough about it. And C, 2007 politically didn't look the same as it does today. Well, surely. Um, but it was, like war wasn't just super prevalent. And then there were tons of war movies already and tons of World War II books. Like, why write another one? So that's kind of what I thought. And then in 2014, when the conflict that we see today on a huge scale that people are trying to solve, apparently, supposedly, it began in 2014, and it began regionally and sort of kind of literally in front of my grandparents' apartment in the city of Donbass. And all of a sudden, this thing that I didn't really think could ever happen in the 21st century, in my lifetime in Europe, was happening again. And it was happening right in front of, the apartment of the man who had this incredible survival story. So it was at that point that I felt like, okay, maybe it is worth writing about war in this day and age. And then the last pivotal, and then I'll stop talking because I can be kind of long-winded. But the last element that really brought it home for me and made me actually start on it was I went back to visit my grandmother who was still alive in the Donbass. There was war going on, but it was kind of a quieter period, and she was 90, actually 92 almost. So it was my last time that I got to see her, and I went there, and what I saw absolutely shocked me. I mean, I think all of us have, we've seen enough footage of sort of what war looks like, both maybe the current one, but also the World War II. But few of us get to experience it in person. And it was a shock, and it did something to me. I think it gave me, like, weirdly gave me confidence to write something from the perspective of a soldier that I didn't have before. I kind of thought like, oh, I'm a girl. What am I doing? Like how could I possibly write anything believable from the perspective of a World War II soldier? And then, yeah, I felt sort of terror, a terror that I think is very specific to war that you kind of don't experience in many other situations in human life. Um, and that's when I began, right after a trip, I happened to move to Berlin, unrelated to the book. It just happened to be there kind of for life. And as soon as I landed in Berlin, this thing started pouring out of me.
Right. And I think we're so lucky in the US that we're not exposed to war on our own lands, but in Europe, wars have raged in every country and across borders, lived through not just one, but many of them. I did some research after reading this because I was learning so much, and I read that over the course of the war, 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured, and of those, 80,000 of the POWs were Jewish. Only 4,700 of the Jewish ones returned home. So just the scale of all this and the loss, and I didn't know about and I say it wrong, the Holodomor, the famine,
Mhm.
and that I was reading that only recently have the Russians thought the famine was in the early 30s before World War II broke out, but that it was intentional by Stalin. Some people say it wasn't, but some people say it was. And you touch on this famine a little bit as background for the loss that and how much death there was before the war even started, and how people had such hardship at that point as well.
Yeah, it was important for me, especially so when you introduced me, said that I finished kind of writing the kind of a draft of the novel, right, as Putin launched this full-scale invasion. And afterward, sort of the book was bought kind of very quickly afterward, but I had a year with my editor at Bloomsbury to work on it. And because I was watching this full-scale invasion, because it affected my family in both Ukraine and in Russia in hugely dramatic and traumatic ways, where most of them became refugees, and there's kids and old people and whatever. Um, so that was like my IRL, my real life was that. And then I had to edit this book, and this book had a lot of Ukrainian elements, and it had this famine, but in my mind, it became kind of important to highlight it more than it was before, because it is something. Kind of this entire war is in a way about history and about Putin thinks that Ukraine belongs to him, essentially, to simplify it, but that more or less. And that there's historic reasons for that. And Ukraine is like, no, you did a lot of bad things to us. No thanks. Right? Like that's kind of sort of the background of what's happening beyond all of these negotiations. And for Ukrainians, it's been very important to kind of talk about their history, to have the forum in the West to explain it and to tell all these kind of horrendous things, such as this famine in the 30s, where it wasn't like the Germans, coming to take over Ukraine, but the Soviets, of whom they were supposed to be kind of a part and an equal partner. Um, so these stories became much more important in the new context of destruction and death and war of today. And I wanted to make sure they're given, enough space in the book, even though initially it wasn't like about that in a way.
I had never heard the term Osterbiter, and
If
no,
I had a penny for every time I hear that,
really,
that comment,
yeah.
I'd be rich.
And I guess the POWs, as they returned back from having to serve there, and the shame that was the culture of the POWs, or the culture of the Russian people, of Ukrainians, of that it was shameful to have been captured, that you should have fought to the death. But how many people were enslaved during World War II by the Germans, whether it was Hitler's List, where they were manufacturing weapons in the factories and all that. But I found that so fascinating, and that given this many years later, that I had never heard that term before. That there
Yeah.
wasn't more in writing about that of people's experiences, but I guess the shame is just so prevalent.
I've actually even more kind of amazingly, I heard the same thing from a German friend, that this, I think Holocaust, rightfully so, gets a lot of attention. And I think, it's been obviously huge for the Jewish community to talk about it and to keep talking about it, even though, it's growing older and older. Um, but the same thing did not happen for this other big tragedy. I also never heard that word, Osterweider, and most people that I mean, actually, no one that I've met so far has, which is amazing. And it just it's 3 million people. Like it's not a small number, right? The POWs, Soviet POWs, it's almost 6 million. Half of them, more than half of them, are murdered. And it's kind of known, this Soviet POW treatment is known as like the biggest military crime in history and also the least known about. Part of the reason is that the Soviet Union didn't want it known about. So while the Jewish community that survived and that escaped to the West has made it its mission to make sure, right, never again. The Soviet Union did the opposite. They wanted their history to be kind of very black and white, like very heroic, and at the same time, kind of there's a victimhood. So like the West, well, okay, the West at this point, but the Germany attacked us and it was horrible and we lost so many people, which is all true, obviously, but we beat them back. And that narrative is it's kind of the common narrative that has been told and that now is back in fashion because at some point during Putin's reign, he realized that what he's missing to really sort of control the public is a national idea. There's really no national idea kind of in when he took over. And there were all of these people that were working on coming up with what's going to be our national idea for Russia. And they came up with World War II because it psychologically combines these very powerful emotions. It affected every single person who is alive today. Like I'm alive because my grandfather survived and my grandmother wasn't carted away to Germany as an Osterbeiter, right? Like, and everybody in some way, and not Jewish as well, have some sort of story that's related to it. And so there's this gratitude toward the grandparents um, who persevered through this horrible crisis and trauma, and also this sense of like we kicked ass. Um, and that's those all of those elements are psychologically super useful to Putin, and he's kind of been using World War II, which is something that I didn't realize until I went to the Donbass right before beginning to write this book. I only saw it there for the first time. The little kind of Soviet-looking posters that said things that I quote in the last chapter, where we made it to Berlin, we'll do it again if necessary, right? So this like bravado, and it's been a very, very useful weapon and one that isn't very much talked about in the Western media.
I'd love to talk about your writing process and the structure and the architecture of the book, so that you really have Yefim and you're going chronologically with his story, and you're reading and weaving in and out the story of Ina and Masha and the Andre and Vita and the children and grandchildren. Did you write it his story first? Did you How did you structure that in the writing process? Because it's so
Um,
interesting as you skip around. Did you write one story all the way and then come back and feed those other parts in?
I really should have kept better notes. Like some writers are good about keeping kind of a diary off the book while they write the book, and I didn't. I regret it. I was also birthing children and moving countries, so my mind was kind of
A little
so
busy.
it was a little more haphazard than I would have liked as an answer right now, honestly. But it was very useful to have half the book take place during the war, where a lot of kind of dramatic things happen, and half of it take place during kind of let's call it peace, between World War II and this current war. Um, because it would have been really exhausting to write just about World War II or just about like Soviet life and family drama. And it was really nice to have this balance. And it was so writing wise, yeah, I mean, I typically finish a chapter at a time. I don't like midway through paragraphs start working on a different thing, um, but I kind of interchange depending on how much I had, like how much I had to build on, or like, and I'll also give you an example and show you actually your little treat. So, one of there was a bunch of research I had to do, obviously, but one of the things that ended up being very helpful was my grandmother's memoir. Um, and it's very boring, but like there's a lot of boring stuff about, I don't know, her being a paleontologist, and I went to this conference, stuff like that. But amongst the boring stuff, there are these gems. They're incredible. She had like an elephant's memory, and these gems helped kind of inspire me sometimes. So I would read it and reread it and then come across something. So like there's an entire chapter where Yefim and Nina go to Crimea, and kind of there is a reset a little bit for their relationship because they had not taken a vacation in 25 years and suddenly they do. And it was literally based on kind of one sentence that she mentions. It's like, oh yeah, we went to Crimea, and she doesn't say more about it at all. She doesn't say it was a reset for our relationship, like none of that. Um, but it gave me enough to be like, wait, this could be interesting. This could work in the novel, and then I would kind of go off and figure it out. There's chapters that I wrote that were cut entirely. I'm very sad about them. I still have the file somewhere. And those are the ones that I, of course, spent the longest time on because they were the hardest to research. But yeah, that's the editorial process that just happens.
I could never write a book, so I'm fascinated by authors and their process. I'd love to open this up to questions from our alumni that are here because I'm sure other people have things that they would like to have answered. Joyce, do you want to call on them to, if anybody has a question, if you want to raise your hand or raise a little icon hand or however, have any questions?
Otherwise, I'll just keep talking, you guys.
Andy, you had emailed me with a question. Do you want to ask that question, Andy Halpern?
I want to ask all sorts of questions, but I'll try to keep it short. Thank you, Linda, my pal, and Sasha. It's a pleasure to meet you. I read your book in 3 days. A, because I didn't want to incur Linda's wrath if I didn't finish it in time, and
Oh,
B,
I'm
because
not that tough. Come on.
and B, because it was just absolutely spellbinding. So thank you for an enjoyable 3 days. I have two questions. One, while I read a lot about World War II, I had not ever read anything from a Ukrainian point of view with the Osterbeiters and all the things you've just talked about. So thank you for enhancing my knowledge, both breadth and depth. What I particularly enjoyed, not only from the historical standpoint, was the examination of sort of guilt and the white lies, or maybe not so white lies, that we tell those we love to protect them. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. I mean, obviously, guilt is sort of a very Jewish concept, and so dealing with that and lying to protect people. And then number two, I went and read Goodreads after I read the book, and I loved it. Give 5 stars, right? And I saw all the comments from people who used words like colonizer
Russian
and
colonizer, yeah.
colonizer, and Russians shouldn't be able to write about Ukraine. And clearly, we're hearing some of that same terminology in the Middle East at the moment, and we have historically. So I'd like your comment on that as well, how that made you feel and what your response might be to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for both. So guilt and yeah, I before even writing this book, I think this is just something that I'm generally fascinated with in life, why we lie to those we love or why we hide things. I remember my grandmother telling me at some point, a woman should have her secrets. Like that was like something she imparted on me, without much explanation. And and so this is something, it was generally a fascination of mine. And then of course, all of a sudden, this grandfather story comes into my lap that deals with that theme on like a much more dramatic scale. The question that arose for the family, it sort of was clear to them immediately why he would hide it if he had a chance to hide it in the Soviet period. But then the question remains, right? Soviet Union falls apart and he doesn't. He continues to not tell. And I wanted to understand like what has the previous 40 years done to a person for them to not be able to let go of that guilt and to carry it with them for the rest of their life. I meet with a lot of Soviet reader or Soviet-born readers right now, from Russia, Ukraine, who read in English, who've immigrated, and you wouldn't believe how often I hear stories that are very similar. And I sort of had that suspicion that my grandfather's not unique and not talking about what happened to him. But it's essentially almost everybody, like the majority of people I hear from, tell me that their so and so never talked about the war or about other Soviet stuff. I feel now that there's this whole generation that was so kind of I don't even know the verb for this to use, but like captured by and kind of influenced by the Soviet mentality and the propaganda that exists in not just Soviet but totalitarian regimes that really thrive on making humans feel a certain way on mass scale. Um, and 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 it's just amazing that that lingers for so long, that if you weren't kind of a formed adult by the time it happened to you, or that it's so strong that you will continue carrying it with you until your death. So I've heard that it's super common for that generation in particular to either have hidden it all the way till they die, or on their deathbed to be suddenly like, I need to talk about this thing that happened. I mean, I hear it all over me, all the time, all around me. Um, so it's guilt that, I mean, I think we all do it. Like, I think in any culture, there's family secrets, right? Like, we don't tell our partners everything about us for various reasons. The question is, do we do it to protect them, or do we do it to protect ourselves? And at what point are we convincing ourselves that we're doing it for them, but really are doing it for ourselves? So I think it's a big, interesting psychological question, and this is just an example how that was done on kind of weirdly mass scale. Goodreads. So the backstory to it is that I wrote an article for New York Times about the decision to not tell my son, who was 4 at the time, about a war that had started between the two countries his mom was from, where he has relatives and where we were about to go visit. Um, and I sort of explore that, and this sort of kind of the New York Times editor wanted me to make it a lot about language. So I'm not telling about the war, but I continue my quest to teach him Russian. And they, as news media likes to do today, they put kind of a provocative headline on it that's now been removed. And it said like Russian something, I don't even remember, but it used the word Russian, and that is often enough to set off like the Ukrainian internet people who are, Um, so these aren't people who read the book, which is the problem with Goodreads, is that anybody can just say whatever about anybody. And I'm certainly not the only one who's come under fire on Ukraine books, but also on other, like a lot of race books, that deal with race stuff often get similar review bombing situations. There is kind of the element that because I grew up in both, and because I am ethnically all kinds of things, none of which match my passports or my language. It's very confusing, and I don't really like feel like it's my job to go around and tell everybody all the complicated, like my mom is from Uzbekistan and my grandfather was a Muslim. Like it's just too crazy. Like my particular situation is too crazy. And a lot of immigrants from former USSR, because most of us were Russian speaking, we and Americans and the publishing industry used to, until this war, refer to all of us as Russian Americans. That's like the shorthand. Without, because that makes it easier to not have to explain to Americans where like Moldova is or Uzbekistan, all of these, mysterious places. Tell Russian Americans, and that's what I used to call myself. And so there's this anyway, that's what it's all about. It's not people read the book. It was very traumatic for me. Obviously, it's my first novel, and all of these hundreds of people are just saying really mean things about me. And the book is kind of for them, but they don't even know what the book is about or have access to it. So, but I've moved on, other than when people ask me about it.
Thank you,
But
Sasha.
also leave a good review. Actually,
I
because
think
you actually read the book, and it's just
everybody I think that I've known that has read it has just loved it, and it's such an accomplishment. Congratulations on it. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. This conversation is fascinating. I think we've all learned so much. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms. So we can, I think Joyce is going to put us in about 3 breakout rooms where we can discuss a little bit more about the book, and then we'll come back together after that. But there's so many more questions I want to ask you about what you're writing next and all so many things, but really wanted to thank you for taking the time to be with us and to share your book and your accomplishments.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Enjoy the breakout rooms. Trash talk it if you want. Now you're free to do so. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This was great.